Good morning and welcome to the first of 3 final training webinars by the RAMSES project. The topic for today is understanding urban heat effects and the core dimensions of resilient systems for improved urban quality. Our speakers for today are Hans Huibergs from VITO and Annemie Wiekman from NTNU. And the introduction to the RAMSES project will be conducted by Alberto Terenzi from ICLE. So we will start with a brief introduction, followed by an introduction to the project. This will be followed by a presentation on the urban heat effects and climate change, and then a Q&A. So for questions and answers, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box, or also you can also unmute yourself and ask your questions out loud. This will be then followed by a presentation on the core dimensions of resilient systems, characteristics, and benefits for urban quality, followed by another Q&A, and then we will wrap up and tell you what our next steps are as a project. So, as I just mentioned, for questions and comments, please write them in the chat windows. If you have any technical problems, please write directly to Alberto Terenzi, and for questions to all panelists. So Alberto, can you please now give us the introduction to the project?
Yes, good morning everybody. This is Alberto Terenzi from ICLE, and I'm going to give you a short account on the RAMSES project. As you might know, the RAMSES project is a 5-year research project, currently in its last year. So we have a lot of work that we have already carried out, and the project will be finishing at the end of September. So the first aspect of the RAMSES project that it is important to underline is why do we choose to work on cities? Of course, because cities are complex systems and they play a crucial role in the sustainability transitions, and cities are also the perfect places to generate co-benefits, given that in a very confined space there are different complex systems that interact. For example, an environmental system, an infrastructural system, a socioeconomic system. So cities are also, for this reason, very much vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and they need information in order to understand how to respond to climatic threats and how to adapt to climate change. So this is the aim that RAMSES has, to produce information that cities can use in order to adapt and to transition towards a better state in the face of climate risks. And to do so, the RAMSES project has combined 2 different approaches. One approach is a top-down approach, which means an approach that looks at cities in general in Europe, so which are the main regional threats cities face in Europe, and what kind of hazards can cities expect that will impact on their territory. But on the other hand, cities also need so-called bottom-up approaches, so approaches that are detailed, because in the end, even if in a city, which is a system that might be more vulnerable and less vulnerable spots, so in order to plan thoroughly on climate change adaptation, cities also need to know exactly where they should intervene, given their specific urban structure and characteristics. So as I said, cities are complex systems, so the RAMSES project has looked over a number of different parts of those systems that are crucial for cities. So on the one hand, one focus on the project was on impacts and vulnerability assessments, and to this part, of course, pertain climate change scenarios and small-scale vulnerability and risk assessments, and also a definition and taxonomy of architecture and infrastructure in cities. So what makes architecture and infrastructure in cities resilient? Then one central aspect of the project is on cost assessments. So what are the costs of climate change, and what are the costs and the benefits of climate change adaptation? But also what are the specific costs for example, for the health system. So how is health impacted, for example, by heat, and what are the costs that these impacts produce, and how can cities strategize and plan to reduce these costs? And finally, what RAMSES has looked at is more the political and institutional assessment. Adaptation is a process, and it is not only about planning scattered measures to respond to one or the other hazard, but it is in the end a decision that can have also long-term implications for cities. So cities need to be very aware on where to they want to transition in the future. So one specific action of RAMSES is to making cities understand how they can create pathways towards a more sustainable future. And of course, all of this research is intended to be applied research. So throughout the project, we have tried to keep in touch with stakeholders through stakeholder dialogues in order to understand if the RAMSES research was going in the right direction or if tweaks were needed. And out of that research, we have also developed a toolbox that I will give an account to on a bit later in my presentation, which is basically condensing the main results of the project in a format that can be of support for cities and policymakers so that they can use this knowledge concretely to progress on adaptation. I would just like to give you a couple of insights into the project. So as I was saying, one part is about the high-level climate risk assessment. So 571 cities were analyzed, and basically their hazards were intertwined with their exposure to those hazards. So speaking about population, assets, and so on. And then their vulnerability was also taken into account. And all of this was done to evaluate basically the risks that they were exposed to. We're talking here, as I was saying, about high-level assessments. So these are not assessments that go in detail into the urban fabric of a city, but that give a general understanding of the macro risks that cities are exposed to in Europe. On the contrary, for some cities, for example, the cities of Antwerp and London, high-resolution modeling for certain hazards, for example, fluvial flooding, and heat have been conducted. These cities are the RAMSES core cities, so-called. So they have had a stronger role in the project, and they have been able to use these results already to be included in adaptation reports that have fed then the adaptation actions in the cities. So this is the other part of the project about really providing detailed analysis and assessments. And then, as I was saying, we have developed modeling and projections, and I think that one striking findings of those modeling is that according to the scenarios produced, the number of heat wave days is projected to increase by a factor of 10 between 2081 and 2100. So this points very clearly in the direction that something needs to be done in cities to avoid that these risks creates a lot of impacts in the future. Just another aspect that I was mentioning is about the costs of climate change, and especially the London School of Economics have conducted a research on how urban heat affects work productivity, for example, in a city. And so for different economic makeups of different cities, they have assessed the effectiveness of different adaptation measures that you can see in the slides, and which ones are more apt to respond to heat in light of a specific composition of the work sector, in light of the structure of city economies. And then, as I said, health. So how can we evaluate the economic costs of health, and also how can we evaluate how to adapt to those and which measures to implement to counteract them. There is a tool developed by the World Health Organization, which is also a partner in the project, that can be used for that. It is open for download from the RAMSES website, so it can support cities in this endeavor. And finally, as I said, I would like to spend a couple of minutes on the so-called RAMSES toolbox. This is basically an endeavor that we have carried out in the project to condense the knowledge that derives from the project, which has been produced in the form of reports, papers, so scientific findings, into a format that could be immediately of support for city administrations and city policymakers. So we have developed 3 products. One is an audio-visual guidance. So we have gone around asking climate experts of different kinds, scientists, but also practitioners, also cities that have already worked on climate adaptation, to talk about different topics in a very short format. So we have videos that are like between 60 seconds and 2 minutes, and that can actually give some wisdom to cities that are approaching climate adaptation on what it is important to focus on, how to approach and tackle problems, and also how to structure an adaptation process. These videos can be used, of course, also to talk to, for example, people that don't know climate change so well or are not convinced. In this case, they can be an ally of having a very influential person in the field explaining these things to people. Then we have developed a RAMSES slide deck. This is basically a collection of slides that summarize the project results and that city practitioners can use directly. They can download them from the RAMSES website in PowerPoint format. They can tweak them to their needs, and they explain in a very clear and short format some of the main results of the project, so they can be used for example, meetings in the city with other stakeholders in order to explain the importance of adapting. And then, last but not least, of course, we had the transition handbook and training package. As I said, RAMSES focused very much on transitions and on the importance of creating a process around adaptation with a well-defined goal, and this is exactly what we try to support with the transition handbook. So basically what the transition handbook does is that it embeds some of the key findings of the project in the urban adaptation support tool, which is the adaptation management tool and structure used also by the Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and so presents a step-by-step process to cities that they can use to structure their action. And to that, the training package, which is contained in the same document, refers back to the steps that are presented in the handbook and suggests some practical hands-on activities that city administrations can use to operationalize adaptation, for example, by organizing a meeting, or for example, on how to involve stakeholders, how to collect perceptions of risks, and other important activities. So this tool is available. It can be downloaded by from the website. The link is in the slide, and we hope that many cities will use it to support their climate adaptation planning. And with that, I am finished, and I would like to thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Alberto. That was quite a good introduction into the project. And now we will move on to Hans. Hans, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Serena and Alberto, for organizing this webinar. I'll introduce you to the aspects of urban heat effects and the influence of climate change thereon that has been studied within the RAMSES project in a work package that is under the lead of VITO, but in which also many of the other partners have contributed. So I'll also refer to them a little bit coming on. Just a short overview of what I'll be talking about. I'll tell you something about the special conditions that are observed in cities related to heat, and I'll introduce you to the fact that there are actually two negative effects, and that is on the daytime heat stress and on the nighttime temperatures. In both cases, the city influences the parameters in a negative way. I'll tell briefly something about what climate change will have as an effect, and I'll briefly also say something about adaptation measures. But to start with, just I want to introduce you to the urban heat island. Maybe you're already familiar with this effect, but basically the effect is that cities tend to be warmer than their rural surroundings, and this has an effect on two main meteorological parameters, and one is the nighttime temperature and the other is the daytime heat stress. And there are several negative effects that are related to this urban heat island effect, but I just want to talk about one here as an illustration, and that's basically the increased mortality that is being observed in urban areas compared to rural locations. This is a study that has been done in relation with the 2003 heat wave in France, and it compares actually the number of additional deaths in small towns with the number of additional deaths in the large cities in France, and you can clearly see that the number of additional deaths in the small towns, it's around 40%, but in Paris it's even 3 times larger. And this is basically related to this urban heat island, and this actually is not only seen in this heat wave for 2003 in France, but it's also observed in other heat waves and in other studies. So this is basically the reason why we should be concerned about this urban heat island. Now, before showing you some results that we obtained within the RAMSES project, I want to say something shortly about why cities tend to be warmer than the rural surroundings. And basically, there are 3 main reasons. And well, the first reason is basically the fact that there are more buildings in cities, of course, more buildings, more sealed soil, and both of them are actually capable of storing additional heat during the day, which they then release during the night, causing the higher temperatures at night. But secondly, they also cause additional radiation being reflected by the walls, and to reduced ventilation in narrow streets, which also cause the high daytime heat stress. Secondly, there's the lack of evaporation, so cities cool less because there is less vegetation within the city center. And thirdly, also humans are causing additional heat in cities. For instance, cooling devices or traffic exhausts cause what we call anthropogenic heat sources, increasing the temperatures in the city center even more. Now, I'll first want to show you something about the temperatures within a city center, and these are actually maps that we obtained within the RAMSES project using the URBCLIM model that we use at VITO, which is able to visualize the temperature difference between the city center and the rural surroundings on an hourly basis during a typical summer day over here. So what you see here is a map of the city of Antwerp in Belgium. And it actually shows you basically the temperature difference between the city center and a rural measurement station in the neighborhoods of the city center. So, and the more blue the figure is, the smaller the temperature difference is. The more red, the higher the temperature difference is. But you clearly see if you start during the morning hours at 8, 9 o'clock, then there's not much temperature difference between the city center and the rural measurement station. But if you go on during the evening, when actually the rural surroundings start getting cooler around 7, 8 p.m., then the city center is still being hot. The cooling is less effective in the city center. And this actually causes a high temperature difference between the city and its rural surroundings, which actually gets to its peak around 12 at night, 1 in the morning. So this typically shows you that the temperatures are much higher in the city center during the night. And we actually did not only study this for the city of Antwerp, but we actually studied it for approximately 100 cities in Europe within the RAMSES project. You can find the link on the slide. If you go to this website, you'll see that there are results for many cities in Europe where we actually show the mean temperature difference between a location in the city and the rural surroundings for a typical summer. I think it's summer of 2011. On the right, you see a short inset. Now, this is actually just a rough screening method where we just used one summer and we just looked at one parameter, the mean temperature at midnight, and at a quite rough spatial resolution of 250 meters. But with the same model, you can actually do more detailed studies of specific cities, and that's what's shown on the top right, where you see an image for the city of Brussels, the capital of Belgium. And this is actually focusing at the mean temperature difference between city and rural surroundings at 11 at night. But it's for a much longer time period. It's for 20 years of data from 1986 to 2005, and it's at a higher resolution. This is actually looking at 100 meters, and using those maps you can actually see where in your city center the highest temperatures are found and where you actually have to take adaptation measures to reduce nightly temperatures. Using this study for 100 cities, we were also able to quantify the urban heat island a little bit. And we found that for a typical Western European city, the mean temperature difference at midnight is approximately 4 degrees Celsius. But that's only for a mean summer night. If you actually look at the hottest summer nights, like the ones that we are experiencing right now in Belgium, it gets up to 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. So we also were able to find out the most important factors that influence the magnitude of this urban heat island, and these turn out to be the wind speed, because if the wind speed is smaller, there's less ventilation in your city center. Usually it's also related to the distance away from the sea of the city center. And secondly, also the population is important, as large cities have a larger urban heat island effect. So this is basically focusing on nighttime temperatures, but I would just want to show one more thing about these nighttime temperatures, namely what happens if you take climate change into effect. This is what we see on this graph. On the left-hand side, you see the results for Antwerp for the mean temperature at midnight in the reference period, 1986 to 2005. And on the right-hand figure, you actually see the same map, but then for the future climate for the last 20 years of this century. There's, of course, a very large difference between the temperatures that we see in both figures, owing to the climate change effects. But if you actually consider the temperature difference between the city center and the rural surroundings, then you find out that the temperature difference remains approximately the same. There's of course a huge uncertainty related to this, but so the UHI effect on itself is not getting larger, but the temperatures of course are increasing both rurally and on urban locations. Now if you convert that to heat wave days, taking into account basically thresholds, and here we use a definition related to the Belgian legislation, but you can actually take similar types of definitions of heat wave days into account, then you find that the number of heat wave days increases by a factor of 10, the plots that were already showed by Alberto before. And we actually observe this for almost every city that we've studied. And of course, if you take into account that city centers are already the hottest places right now, then in the future you will end up with very high temperatures over there and very large number of heat waves, causing also additional mortality. Now, this is what I wanted to say about the temperature effects at midnight, but actually temperatures are not the only important factor when taking human health and thermal comfort into account. There are other factors like wind speed, radiation, and humidity. They're actually all influenced negatively within the city center. Now, there are a lot of indicators to actually analyze these effects, but usually you just convert them into some types of classes, and so I won't discuss that much more in detail over here. I just want to show you what you actually can do with some model examples for Brussels, looking at the heat stress on a typical hot day during the summer of 2003 in Brussels. And well, this is actually the graph that we obtained for Brussels, where the blue locations are the one with the lowest heat stress and the red locations are the one with the highest heat stress. It's actually a very high resolution image. We take the buildings and the trees into account, and then you can get up to a resolution of 2 meters. And clearly you see that the highest temperatures are observed in some street canyons in a city center, while lower temperatures, the blue areas and the yellow areas, are observed in parks or in streets where there are a lot of trees, where people can go in the shade to actually reduce their heat stress. You can actually visualize it in another way. There's a link to a movie beneath the slides. If you go there, you'll find a movie with these type of lights on a Google Earth base. And also there you can see that the highest temperatures are observed in the street canyons, while lower heat stress is found at locations where there are some trees present. Okay. Now, the last part, I want to pay some attention to adaptation measures, and Alberto already told you something about this transition handbook in a training package. There's a lot of information on adaptation in these things. There's also another work, there's also another report by NTNU on adaptation measures that has been composed within the RAMSES project, which contains a whole list of possible adaptation measures. And I'll just introduce you to some possibilities you have to adapt your city and to reduce the negative effects of heat. A simple option, or an option that is usually referred to, are of course green spaces. Introducing green in your city not only reduces the soiled surface or the percentage of soiled surface in your city, but it also creates extra evaporation, so effectively cooling your city. And there are many ways in which you can introduce green. You can use parks, green parking lots, green roofs, green walls. There are many options available over there, and these are just a few that are being used quite often now. But there are also other options than just introducing green, and these are often less known. Often these measures are related to introducing additional shade. This is, for instance, possible by just, you see a nice picture in the middle below of how you can turn a hot place into a cooler place by just introducing shade. But you can even go further, and the picture on the bottom right is something which is being done in Singapore, where they actually try to introduce cold air from above the street canyon into the street canyon by climate regulation, which is also a very effective way to cool actually your street canyons. There are also many other options related to additional water on top in the middle you see a water channel. This type of things are used in Freiburg in Germany. Water fountains or other options. Of course, it's also good to combine these water options together with the green options like floating gardens. So there's much a co-benefit of introducing additional blue measures and green measures in your city. And lastly, an option which is also working quite well is introducing additional white roofs into your city, because then there's much more reflection of the solar radiation coming into the city center, and so the heat is not stored in the building but is reflected again into the air. Now we often get questions about how good these adaptation options are, and the main message we want to convey there is it depends on what you want to do. If you actually want to tackle the temperature urban heat island effect in your city, then you need a lot of green. We did some simulations for the city of Antwerp, and there we found out that if you want to reduce the urban heat island by 50%, so I'm speaking about the midnight temperatures, if you want to decrease the urban heat island there by 50%, you need approximately 60% of vegetation in every grid. So that's really a lot. So at every location in your city, you need like 60% of them should be covered by vegetation, which is nearly impossible in most modern Western European cities. So the effect on tackling the temperature UHI effect is not that large. But on the other hand, if you look at the local heat stress, especially the daytime heat stress, then these effects are much larger. I won't go too much into the details, but if you plant a tree somewhere, then the effect beneath this tree is very large. And in this way, it is a very good way to adapt your city to at least reduce the daytime heat stress. There's much more about this that can be found in the reports of the RAMSES project, of course. But I think my time is almost gone, so I'll just conclude by saying that there are two negative effects related to cities. That's the higher nighttime temperature and a high daytime heat exposure. And that climate change will actually enhance these negative effects even more. And then lastly, I've introduced you to some adaptation measures and showed you what you can do with these. So thank you very much for your attention. Here are some links for much more information, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to hear them.
Thank you very much, Hans, for this very lovely presentation and the very useful information. We will now take a questions and answers session. So please let me know if you have any questions and I can unmute you, or also please feel free to type them in the chat box. Okay, it seems like we don't have any questions, so we will move on to the next presentation by Annemie from NTNU. Annemie, please, you have the floor. Please feel free to start.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, I think so.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, it's very nice that Hans already made this introduction and actually started with the very detailed matter and the simulations, the modeling that needs to be done in order to know which measures would fit in which locations at which time and to which extent. I want to take a step back and look at the bigger perspective from an architectural planning and infrastructure point of view. I am the head of Work Package 2 in the RAMSES project, which deals with resilient architecture, infrastructure, and urban environment. And during that, in that work package, we have developed a mapping of indicators for resilient architecture, infrastructure, and urban environments. We have looked together, of course, with other institutions at physical and cost typologies for buildings and infrastructures. And we have investigated the 8 case study cities in RAMSES, 4 in Europe, 4 elsewhere in the world, and their climate action plans, their adaptation plans, but also their urban development plans, to look for elements that could contribute to climate change adaptation and resilience in those cities. And based on that, we have put together tables with indicators, with examples, and with ways to follow up on this. And then some of this has been implemented, as Hans mentioned, in an investigation of urban adaptation effects on urban climate, and then especially a case study with the city of Bilbao. And I will show you examples of these during the presentation. All of this is also presented in the transition handbook that was produced by RAMSES. So you can find the overall results, methods, etc. in that handbook. If you want more details and, for example, look at the detailed tables of indicators, of measures, of different analysis of the city, you can, at the same website, you can look at the specific reports, the deliverables that are mentioned on this slide. So where we started was, we have 8 case cities in the RAMSES project. And we investigated these cities. We asked for their documents on climate change adaptation, so their adaptation plans, their other maybe resilience strategies, but also looking at climate change mitigation, at sustainable development strategies, even at smart city strategies. So we wanted to look both, what are they doing specifically under the heading of climate change adaptation, but also, do they actually have other measures, other strategies in their other documents, in their other policies that could actually be linked to adaptation, but of which people maybe are not aware, or which may be happening in different municipal units, etc., so that we can try to link these better together. So we investigated whether then resilience and adaptation is mentioned, taken into account in main goals, in measures, in strategies, whether it has been operationalized, if the impact has been assessed and described, if the costs have been assessed and described, if they are legally binding or merely as suggestions, what kind of methodology they have followed, and which kind of stakeholders were involved in developing these strategies, and then whether these are actually also followed up. So if it's actually an operational document that is embedded into, for example, approval of development projects, or anytime a decision needs to be taken on transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, building infrastructure, are those strategies actively used or no? And then, of course, also to which degree, so when assessing the impact, so have they actually worked with experts? Do they have in-house experts on doing these simulations and modeling, etc.? Or do they need external consultants to come in, and then the municipality actually develops the measures? So we looked at, we investigated those documents from all of the 8 cities, and then we also had workshops, meetings with the city of Antwerp and the city of Bilbao. And one result of this investigation was that on the right-hand side of the slide, you see a list of measures. So from those adaptation videos, we actually extracted the most common measures that the cities developed, had implemented, and also then if there were specific results that they could showcase. So did it actually work? Were there any challenges that needed to be solved, etc.? And in the report D2.4, so you can find all of those lists. You can also find indicators for it. You can find also find where it has been used, additional reference, for example, if you want to know more. And then we also categorize all of those so you can look per, for example, per type of infrastructure. So if it's green, blue infrastructure, gray infrastructure, per scale of implementation, per threat that is addressed, if it's flooding or heat wave or drought or something else. And we also try to map then the expected outcomes. So what can you expect from a certain measure? How can you measure its performance? So what would be the appropriate indicators? And so we try to just condense all of that into this one report. But then we saw also that when we investigated all of these documents and we talked to the cities, there is much more than just trying to prevent flooding from happening or to mitigate the impact that such a flooding might have, or to do the simulations and then find an appropriate action. Most, if not all, cities were, of course, very interested in how you can just mainstream any kind of adaptation or resilience action into daily urban planning and management. One of the challenges we saw with some cities is that if you have a special unit that is responsible for adaptation and you have a separate adaptation plan that is not linked very well with the mainstream sustainable development, master planning documents and strategies of the municipality, then it's very difficult to merge those. So we try to, when we looked at those documents, we saw that there are quite a lot of other other elements. It's not just about the flooding. You know, can you prevent the flooding? Can you remove the water as soon as possible? But there were a lot of other things that came up in terms of adaptability or diversity in cities, in urban design, on feedback systems, on even the way in which decisions are being taken. So we started to map those as well. In the transition handbook, you can see tables. It's table 45, I think. You can see tables then of those different characteristics, a short description, and then you can see how that would link to gray infrastructure, green and blue infrastructures, to land use, mobility, urban-rural interfaces, architecture, public space, urban regeneration, so the more urban planning and infrastructure and architectural strategies. So, of course, I know that these tables are big. It's better if you look at them in the transition handbook. I have extracted a few of these. So all of those measures are in detail described in report D2.1, and they are then followed up into D2.3, the analysis with the cities. So you can see a detailed description of where we found those particular dimensions in the different city strategies. But then I will just show you a brief overview here of those types of dimensions and that we found that we think can bring urban planning, infrastructure design, and adaptation measures and strategies much more closely together. So one of the main things, of course, is planning for adaptability and flexibility. So whether your existing urban design and system infrastructure or the new one you are designing, whether it has a capacity to change while maintaining or improving its functionality, if it can be evolved, improved during its functionality, if you could adopt alternative strategies or pathway quickly if the function declines, and if you can respond to changes over time. So basically a flexible structure. Also, for example, what we see is that if you have a building mass that is very depending on mechanical ventilation in order to cool, to get a better indoor temperature, then if the power is cut, for example, or if you have fluctuations in temperature, that system is not very flexible, because if functionality, if the building mass itself, if the insulation is not properly designed, if there is no way for natural ventilation, for example, or for other comfort measures, then it is then if the power shuts down, then your functionality is gone. So how can you design to have several pathways in terms if one calamity occurs? Of course, the importance of local ecosystem services. Hans has already shown a few pictures then of green. You have parks, roofs, etc. So a lot of cities then have strategies for green infrastructures, but they are not necessarily linked to adaptation strategies. Or maybe just superficially they are mentioned, but they are not actively used. So, of course, any kind of blue-green infrastructure, whether it's at building level or a neighborhood scale or larger, can be used for flood control, for temperature regulation, for pollutant filtration, local food production, so other types of ecosystem services, and to use that actively into urban design and planning can provide, of course, a much better quality of urban environment, while also, in case of calamity, also providing these types of adaptation measures. We saw that often a city looks at one type of infrastructure. You have different units looking at transportation infrastructure, energy infrastructure, etc. And then you see that if a calamity occurs, there is often an effect of that it's not just one thing that breaks down. If one thing breaks down, it affects the functionality of another type of infrastructure, which then also might break down, etc., etc. So a cascading effect, a domino effect. So we also looked at whether those city strategies, it's not just whether they can absorb, an infrastructure can absorb a certain shock and how much of a shock it can absorb, but also then these cumulative effects. If functionality of one type of infrastructure is reduced or at one location, does it then affect other types of infrastructure? For example, if a bridge collapses, does it affect also the power supply? Does it affect other things? So we try to look at these types of domino effects, and then also that if we to always make sure that there are diverse pathways. It's not just one solution, because if that solution breaks down, you don't have an alternative. So always look for alternative pathways. And that is then where this diversity also comes in, both in terms of spatial diversity, having different types of design and planning throughout the city, different types of functionality, so that if one part breaks down, you can still rely on the functionality of another one. Of course, also then we saw that if an event has occurred in one location, it doesn't always mean that people have, or that the city has learned from that event into a next one. Very often we saw that, let's say that so one event, a calamity has occurred in one place. The exact effects of that calamity have then been interpreted, and the corresponding measures have been used throughout the whole city, but not on. So it was quite limited on how systematically a city or a unit would learn from the past and then design better for the future, or that maybe only the actors that were directly involved in the event had passed this on into their next project, but that it was not disseminated properly. Of course, also in terms of performance, a lot of cities are investing heavily into zero energy districts and high-performing buildings and infrastructures. So are we sure that high performance in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction is compatible with adaptation? Or are we just trying to make something much more efficient and much more unifunctional, and then it is no longer resilient? Also then the responsiveness of the system. If a calamity occurs, how quickly can it regain its function? And can you, it not maybe necessarily the exact same function, but at least a functionality that can be comparable to the original one. Also looking at, I've already mentioned this partially, redundancy and modularity. If one part of a system or an element breaks down, do you have an alternative? Can something else replace it? Can take over the function temporarily? And how much capacity to how much stress or can something withhold without degradation or loss of function, or with a minor reduction in function? And of course, something that's very important for cities, so the co-benefits. You don't just do this for adaptation, that is of course serious enough, but if you can in addition prove that it is an added value to the quality of urban space, or that it improves accessibility, or it improves touristic value, etc., it's much easier to get the investments you need into those measures. And then the resourcefulness of the city to manage this. Do you have all the governance systems in place to identify, to detect, to mobilize resources, to evaluate what needs to be done, etc.? And to which degree are citizens involved in this? So what we did with the city of Bilbao then is to look at their Heatwave challenges, and then to try to develop recommendations and guidelines for what kinds of measures they could use to mitigate the urban heat island effect. And what we looked at then is, so there's three types of building, of city structures, compact low-rise, compact mid-rise, and open-set high-rise areas of the city. We analyzed these, and then especially in terms of typologies. So what is the built structure like? What is the street structure like? What is the street with the building height, the compactness, the materials that are used in different sections of the city? And then through simulations and analysis, we developed then guidelines for green roofs, for adding vegetation on the street, for other types of measures that could help mitigate the urban heat island effect based on height of buildings, width of the street, on types of traffic, on orientation of the street, on exposure of the facades, etc. And you heard Hans say that, so of course you would need a lot of vegetation to mitigate an urban heat island effect. But what you can influence is the local comfort of people in the street, for example. If you have a heat wave, you want to locally reduce the temperature, or at least the experienced temperature for people. And that is then where such measures, looking at specific streets, specific buildings, specific materials, and local measures, can actually help improve the comfort of people to a large degree, and thereby also then reduce the chance of illness, of being affected, or maybe even then death. So all of those things, in a short overview, are included in the transition handbook. If you want to read in more detail, you can look at the reports D21 and etc. On the RAMSES website, or you can of course ask us for more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annemie, for your presentation. Sorry, one second. Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. We will now take further questions and answers. And we already have an observation from a participant. So the observation was that in some cases, i.e. the Mediterranean climate, summers are very dry and they prevent a seamless grass cover unless the green areas are under constant irrigation, which is rarely feasible. For example, in the case of Rome, the urban heat island has a peculiar shape because it is deformed toward the eastern part of the city, which is sparsely urbanized. This is because an active ventilation during summer months tends to shift the hot air from the center of the city. Brighter road paving, example concrete instead of asphalt, and brighter roofs seem to be very effective, although those measures can heavily conflict with cities' architecture and historical centers in particular. So this was the observation. Annemie, Hans, does either of you have a response or a comment on this?
Well, I can start. Yes, I agree with this. So, and these are exactly some of the things we try to investigate. In some cases, as you could also see from some of the pictures of Bilbao that I showed, so if you work in the historical center, maybe you can find out that adding vegetation, green roofs, green facades might be very effective, but that is of course not possible in a protected area. So then you have to look at some of the other measures, such as always also mentioned, can you induce more natural ventilation, for example? Can you work with other materials? So a lot of measures are under development that specifically for historic areas. So where maybe you have adapted materials, so it's not the traditional road paving, but other types. So a lot of things are being developed specifically for those types of areas. We actually, from the architectural and an urban design point of view, so we also worked a lot with, for example, China, on exactly trying to see as an alternative for all of those mechanical systems. So how can you work with even adapted then to Chinese characteristics? What kind of materials, designs, vegetation, etc. can you use? And there, the knowledge of the local population, also for European cities, usually there is a lot of tradition and a lot of knowledge that has been implemented locally by citizens that are not necessarily embedded into a city's adaptation strategies. So that is why also this importance of discussing this and developing solutions with local population is always a very good idea.
Thank you very much, Annemie. Hans, do you have also something to add? Okay, I guess not. So are there any further questions and answers? Oh, now we can hear you, yes.
Okay, yeah, there was apparently something wrong. My computer is updating in between. Apparently, cloud issue. No, I agree with Annemie that often working with local people can be very beneficiary to find new options. Regarding the green, it's indeed a problem, not only a Mediterranean climate, but also if I look outside nowadays in Belgium, the last days, there's not much green grass left in city parks. So there are some techniques that are, for instance, being developed now in Australia, where people also try to catch the rain during the rainy season and try to store it in underground departments in order to have some water left to keep grass green or plant green in summer, but even that in the future can become very tricky. So yes, it's indeed an issue that we have to look for other possibilities over there, and for other ways to cool this down. The same, I think, for the conflicting issues with historical architecture and so on. And then with regard to the case of Rome, I've had a look at the map. It has indeed, you see the effects of hotter temperatures in the east of the city, which is probably less densely urbanized, which is with both an effect that these parts are a bit further away from the sea, so the cooling there is a bit lower. And also affects that, of course, the heat is being transferred from the city to the east. That's some of the things that are indeed seen in that graph. And secondly, we also have to say that this is this 100 cities case study. It's a first rough estimate. It also uses quite rough initial climatic inputs on a quite rough scale, so that could also be an issue over there, that even more detailed study is once done, that these effects are a bit smaller. But in general, it's often seen that regions that are windward from the city have higher temperatures because the heat is getting transferred to there as well. I think that's most what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much, Hans. And it seems like we don't have any further questions and comments. So I will come to the next slide, which is RAMSES. What's coming next? Like Alberto mentioned, the RAMSES project is now coming to an end. So this was the first of a set of three final webinars to disseminate the outcomes of the project. So the next one will take place on the 13th of July, and we will have it with Newcastle and LSE, the London School of Economics, on supporting cities in assessing costs of climate change, prioritizing and financing adaptation. The final of the series will take place early in September. The date is still to be determined, and we will have the World Health Organization and Technalia speak about their work on protecting public health from climate change and designing pathways towards more resilient cities. One more final remark is that the RAMSES final conference will take place from the 19th to the 21st of September in Potsdam, Germany. It's called the Cities and Climate Conference, and the early registration ends on the 15th of July, while the final registrations can be taken up to 15th of August. So if you are interested, either visit the website, which is here on the slide, or send an email to city/conference@pic/potsdam.de. Thank you very much for your attendance. It was a pleasure to take part in this webinar. Thank you, Anime. Thank you, Hans. Thank you, Alberto, for your time and your presentations. And I speak on behalf of the entire RAMSES project, and I say that we look forward to staying in touch. Feel free to subscribe to the newsletter and visit our webpage to get further updates. Thank you very much, and have a good day.